Welcome to this post-emerge conversation. I'm glad to be there with Adrian. So this conversation happened just after the Emerge events that happened in Berlin, and we are here to exchange about some idea that really resonated with us, and especially a connection we had about some idea we had about metamodernism and some of the future ideas, and a specific subject that attracted me to this guy was his project on Heidegger meeting another poet in France and the discussion they have about the Black Forest philosopher. So I would like to introduce you, just have an idea about what you are doing, and so we can start to have a talk about something that we don't really talk a lot about in the metamodern movement or the emergence or the future that's going to happen to us.
Thank you, Ronald, for inviting me here. And yes, so the project I'm working with is the Poetree Gestell X, and to just say a few words about it. So it's Heidegger, who has been a big influence, of course, of the French postmodern thinkers. Lived in Germany, actually in the Black Forest. He had a little hut there, and he's a very controversial philosopher, of course. I mean, he was part, like he played a role in during the Third Reich in Germany, and there was afterwards, I think he was really taken on by postmodern thinkers and critiqued, like Derrida was working with it, like other people positioned themselves, like even I think Sartre had a relationship to his work, so you could not get around that work of existential phenomenology.
Yes.
After all that happened. And then there's the other figure, which is Paul Celan. He's very well known in Germany. He was like one of the poets after the war. And Adorno, he talked about you cannot write poetry after Auschwitz. But in my way, in my understanding, Paul Celan succeeded to write poetry where he didn't transcend language or the horror that happened, but it was almost like a lightning rod, of that darkness. And he lost his parents, in the Holocaust. Like his mother got killed, his father was worked to death in a camp. So he had this personal experience and really went into it and channeled that into poetry. So I think he was the first one who was able to write poetry again after Auschwitz in Germany.
Yeah.
And you can see, I mean, you have this controversial philosopher and this important Jewish poet, and they met in the Black Forest, actually, in that little hut that is still standing today. And they wanted, they kind of understood their work on a deeper level, and they were able to hold that polarity, and they wanted to have a dialogue. And they went for a walk, like in kind of like a swamp in the Black Forest, and they I think they met 3 times, and there was this possibility, this openness to to share and to go into a dialogue, but it never fully unfolded. So it's a mystery still. We don't know what they talked about, and they didn't achieve that, or they didn't went into that path of reconciliation that I think would have been quite interesting.
Yeah.
Especially Heidegger never talked about his engagement. I mean, he was always silent. And that meeting in the Black Forest is actually part of the Gestell. So I put a Gestell, with solar panels and like a Raspberry Pi, and you can go there, and there's a wind sensor. So if the sensor is triggered, you see a QR code. And now, and I think this is the interesting part, you end up and you're able to talk to the echo of Celan or the echo of Heidegger, because like I programmed an AI with the works of them. So it's kind of like, it gives you kind of like a sense of what they would say if you ask them a question today. But it's it's not real, but it's as real as it gets. It's like an echo of the past.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's an echo of the future, with where we're going with all the with all the technological development. And of course, Heidegger has a very important technique critique as well. And I think this is also something, there's something around the sensibility, like a metamodern sensibility that, like that we discussed, and that you kind of like feel both. And I think I was very happy, like hearing you react to it and having that resonance, because I felt like, of course, he comes from France, you know, like he's not part of the Nordic school. There's something that really connects, maybe also to French culture and the French stream, and that I really would like to hear more about that from you, because I mean, also Celan lived in Paris, like after the war, all his life. I mean, he killed himself in Paris, so to speak. Yeah. So there's this, like,
the tragic always happen here.
The tragic poetry is really built into this.
Yeah. So the French sensibility you talk about. For me, what triggered me in your project was really that you talk about Heidegger, and I was thinking about language. I was thinking about sensibility. I was thinking about doing something a bit out of the norm with poetry. And it's true that in France, well, I am someone that loves to write and read books and literature from the 20th century, like the great novel from, Franz Kafka and all of that, And we have a much more sensibility of, if I can say that, it's much more about your own singularity, developing your own phenomenological experience and really living life through it. So what really attracted me to your project when I saw it was really, I was like, this guy out there is doing something that most people are not really, maybe not understanding. And from France, the critique I have was always about language. And this is a critique of Heidegger, because I'm a heavy reader of Heidegger. I have a heavy interest in this guy. And the critique of language was that the language become more and more technical, more and more dying. There is a way, like we have many writers nowadays that talk about how the verb is slowly dying, it's decaying, it's no longer language, it's communication, and so the meaning of the word is becoming more and more flat. We are using less and less words, the vocabulary is shrinking. And so, very strangely enough, in some of those meta-modern movements or of the future, they talk about complexity, of the cognitive stage, of development. But people actually, with internet, with the high homogeneity of the communication, the keyword, the language, the memes, there are less and less words circulating, less and less space for new picture, for new image, for new imagination. There is a sort of entropy of possibilities that's happening because everything is shrinking back. And in my own history, I was a student in philosophy and psychology before, I was into theater, and I got some lesson here and there, reading some books, going to some of those seminars, hearing some of those ideas. And I remember one of my theater teacher talked to us about the importance of listening, of hearing. One of his mentors told him that the apocalypse will happen for the human race when we lose the ability to hear. And basically this means when we lose our sensibility, when our body has a thinking, feeling, resonance, sort of being, lose his attributes. And as such, he only used the mind as a purely rational process. And in this sense, this is sort of where we arrive to the technicas that Heidegger talked about, where language is only this pure, raw, communication patterns. And in your process, I saw a tentative or something that tried to bring a little more about poetry, bring a little more about this joy of language, We have a lot of people in France in theater that try to have this more experimental language, this aliveness of language. So language is not just a vegetative thing that's just there, automatic. It's something you have to cultivate, you have to make it alive. And in theater you learn that to not be disconnected from the word you use and who you are, so you don't become disembodied, with yourself. So, and many people in those very spiritual, personal development space, they talk a lot about embodiment and all of that, and developing psychotechnology and using more and more fancy words and more, strategy and techniques. But it's not like we have never figured this out. or we had no idea before, or through the culture or history. This is the first time we are talking about that, or we have this problem. The truth is we have a long chain, a long history of already existing solution. You know, people in theater like Jouvet, he had his own carnet where he wrote about how to feel correctly, like he analyzing his own emotion, his own relationship with his body and all of that, and this inner musicality that comes, you know, with being. And a lot of people are not really aware of that in those kind of space. And by aware, I mean feeling, not just, you know, understanding intellectually, but really feeling. So this is what drew me to your project, you know, it's my own history. It goes from when you are younger, you have this high sensibility, this very aliveness, this libido of life, of hearing, of listening, of being there. And then as you go through, maybe for some it's the corporate life or adapting to the world, they lose the language and they speak more like robots. Oh, I will find my ikigai very soon, or you know, and they have those compressed words, and they have this automatic language that is no longer with affect, and so they get used to this kind of language, and they don't realize how disconnected they become with that. So yeah, this is what really struck me in your work, interested me, and it reminded me of some of the avant-garde that we have in France. Like we have Guy Debord, who wrote the Society of Spectacle, and he had this movement called the Situationists, and they were trying a lot of experiments, like urbanism, psychogeography, how to change the way we move, we have to have a new relationship with times, and they really made a lot of experiments. And when I saw your project, I was like, it looks like an experiment that a situationist will do, you know. So for me, the avant-garde, as it starts, it's not a new psychotechnology within the sphere or something that is already predictable in the field of our current imagination, but it's slightly out of bound, you know, maybe a mix of technology and something else. It's something that expands a bit about what we are thinking about, usually, the type of analogy that we are making logically, you know. So for me, imagination is shrinking. We have the same word, the same image, and there is less and less and less and them. And the stream of information is more and more, there is a more and more hegemony of like the social network, and like the traffic of the internet is going to the same place. So people see the same thing, the same word, the same memes. And they cannot really develop a rich imagination, and or when they innovate, those innovations are still highly predictable. So there is something strange about being in this universe, this century, where we have so much information, so much access to all kinds of things, and yet the ideas, the methodologies, the offering, the imaginary offer are really shrinking and similar, you know. So this is kind of where things are really shady. And this is kind of the subject we are talking about. Language becoming simple, trying to expand the imagination. How do we get back into through this sensibility? Is there something you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, there's a lot to expand here. I think the first one is really, I would say, you know, how do we talk from something rather than about? And to, you know, put it into the metamodern perspective. I think there, you know, you have the cultural sensibility, that structure feeling that oscillates between postmodern or modern theories. Like in the Dutch school, you have Hansi Freinacht in the Nordic school that's very much more normative and political after, you know, like it's kind of like a theory you can work with. And at the same time, for me personally, I realized there is something, you know, in the Black Forest, there's this meeting of the two of them, but there's also something linked to that tradition of phenomenology, where, you know, where you bring the experience into the room and then into language. And I think that's what you're talking about, and that's something definitely we lose with social media. or it's easily lost in social media. You know, like, how do we, as Heidegger would put it, you know, how do we come to the Dasein, to the state of being? How do we presence what comes next? Right? Because emergence, you cannot do emergence, but you can be open for emergence. And that's also what very much relates to what you talked about, the listening. If I, you know, like, if I'm listening deeply enough, it opens a space where something emerges. Yet, it's not something we can do. It needs to be something that it's an art form in itself. And with the art piece, I think it's, you know, it's really trying to grasp this absence of those capacities, or that shrinking, that contraction. Because in a way, the Gestell works with an algorithm, right? So it's like, what is this algorithm? It's not the real Heidegger, of course. It's not real Celan. And what those algorithms produce, it's very interesting, but it's also only an echo of our collective memory and our, maybe even the collective subconscious of the internet, so to speak. And at the same time, it also points to, you know, to this dark and tragic place that we have in Germany. And it reflects into the future as well, because we can see how algorithms are taking over our life, and how there is less creative agency, or there's less creativity driven through the human body. So I think in that sense it relates very much to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because it's like there's something to be cultivated, like a sensibility, even maybe a phenomenological sensibility, with which we are, you know, learning to speak from rather than to speak about.
And there is something about what I would call, because to learn this art form, you need to see artists practicing this art form. So when most people around you have this shrinking language, have those very more and more robotic persona and ways of being, they're also training you, they're also bringing you back in their own world, you know. So the gravitational pull of the disembodied man is getting stronger, if, you know, especially when the environment is highly homogenized. So the danger is increasing, the alertness that you need to have, the amount of personal ecology you need to cultivate in your own mind to stay sane, to stay really in this feeling, in this more melodic way of being with yourself, is getting a bit harder, especially since most of the conversation with the internet, with the algorithm, will tend to gather around a sort of popularity or consensus, which mean relatively easily understandable words, idea, concepts. So a lot of ideas and concepts are bound to be vulgarized and shrink down so that it floats better, it has a better memetics, you know, in the networks. So there is something strange really in the construction of the internet, or specifically about the internet now and the way the network are built, that give a certain favor to this simplification of the mind, which makes people highly vulnerable to form of totalitarianism that they may not be aware about. So it's becoming very subtle, where the own person is instructing themselves or shrinking themselves and getting used to this lower way of being, and they may not even remember the time when they were more complex, more vivid, more rich. It's kind of like there is a loss of memory, a loss of intuition, a loss of listening, and they don't even have the nostalgia of those previous time. So it's very subtle work, it's very hard to explain to many people.
Yeah, and here it becomes interesting because this is what Heidegger talked about when he had this term, the Gestell, like the frame. So I think, despite the critique that I also have about his work and his involvement during the Third Reich, there is a very important piece around the technological critique. Like technology is a frame. It's like a Gestell. It frames you in a certain way. And we have the virtual frame, I think, is quite extraordinary that we have put in with social media, with all the technology we have. So the frame is usually what you describe, like it's very, very rational oriented towards an rational outcome oriented, like this is like optimization, like it's the challenge or the danger of hypermodernity that we're kind of like on the edge to move into. And on the other hand, like if we practice art, it's more of a movement, like he calls it schöpfen, like it's this movement where you cannot like pull a tree out of the ground. It's not gonna grow faster. And I think this is very important for the artistic process. I think it's very important for the metamodern process, because that ability to hold the tension between modernism, postmodernism, between phenomenology and other forms of rationalities, like to hold language in relation to your emotional body and stay in that tension that you're an embodied person. All of this, I think, leads towards a real emergence, towards something that is unfolding, So for me, that's central, and that's why it's a Gestell, and it's something I hope, and in your case, I'm very happy because I feel like you got this intuitively, So I hope to reflect that back on people, what this framing of technology actually can do with us, So there's a very sincere root to that artwork, but it's also very playful, since it's a lot of fun as well, like to play with those algorithms and to get in contact with those echoes of the past.
I have the tragic suspicion that there is also a certain disposition of soul or sensibility in people to be receptive or fully receptive to that, and to have this ability to be ironic and play around and playful, There are people that seems to have a very profound center of gravity in their own personality that seems to be very far away from this playful, free state, when they can play around with concepts. I remember one time I was reading this theory that linked the type of game you like to play with your stage of cognitive development. And so basically the basic stage of play are like the magical play, so it's kind of like the ritual, the game of like random games. Then you have the competitive games, then you have the trans-contextual games, what people like to play with context and their own self as a whole playful thing, and it was related to the stage of cognitive development. And I found this idea very interesting, because I have the suspicion or the observation that many people are very consistent in the favorite way of interacting with reality or the type of game that they like. So for me, something that specifically try to awake something in someone always have a certain cap, a certain limit, based on the kind of seed that they are. So it's kind of like, we'll do the best with what you have, hopefully. And this is kind of what art does too. Marcel Proust had this sentence. He said that literature is here to break the frozen sea of the soul.
This
and
is beautiful.
That's sort of what art is doing to people. But that frozen sea, the property of the sea are fixed, but art can break that and really make that emerge.
And this is a beautiful picture also for, the collective tragedies, the collective traumas that we carry, in Europe. Like there's colonization, there's, You know, there's the Third Reich, there's Second World War. You know, like we are in a state where I feel like with a metamodern sensibility, you know, like we're growing beyond the postmodern fragmentation that grew on all of those tragedies, and it's frozen. You know, like it's a frozen lake that, in some way, if we bring and feel it with our sensibilities, it starts to melt. And it's not an easy task. I think it's not something that is delightful sometimes, because we will discover that depth of feeling and that sorrow that is frozen. But we will feel it with an open heart. And I would call this the, you know, like the natural underneath. Like what are we building? What are we building on? What is hidden in the cellars? You know, like what are the swamps? There is still, you know, that we shouldn't build houses on because they will collapse.
Yes.
And that's something that very much intrigues me, also as a metaphor. And I think you shared that beautifully. You know, like that metaphor, like why actually this swamp, this mud, you know, is important for us. I think, and I mean, you have a great metaphor on that. If you don't mind sharing.
It was one of a workshop I went in, and I think this will also transition to sort of the feedback of what we got from Emerge, you know, and some of the ideas that emerged. But that's one of them. It's a girl that said that the lotus flower can only rise out of the mud, and that's the property, you know, of that specific. And many people, you know, when they think about change, when they think about transforming themselves, when they know that in terms of personality, in terms of sensibility, they are a bit of in the edge of society. They have this deep desire to go down to the center, to be like, I want to be normal, I want to be the new normal, I want to enter this field. And they cannot play with being the lotus flower and just accepting the mud being there. That's the rule. They have something specific to bring and just have the full joyfulness of being exactly that, you know, and going all into that. And this is where I talk about this shadow play, you know, when you know that you are different and sometimes people cannot understand you. You know, those are hard limits. It's not the first time you see human beings, you know they are at some point. Even if you have your own, obviously you have sometimes wrong assumption, but at some point, usually, you tend to have an idea, and you know that there are some ideas that they cannot really understand, and even if you are fully honest, fully sincere, there is still something they will always have an irritation from. So rather than to fight the rules of nature, you can remain playful. Yes, have a mask. Yes, be sneaky, play, be who you are. Have a fun way of interacting with people where you remain in your own fun. That's why I call it the shadow play, because it's in your own mind that you have this extremely joyful experience with yourself. But at the same time, you interact with the other person at the level they are in, you know. And many people don't dare to do that, because there is a bit of a moral voice that is like, you should be honest with everyone and act the proper way, and it kind of neutralizes this force, this freedom of being, and it cut down a bit of feelings and going all into who you are. So learning how to be this lotus flower and remaining there, and that's your role, you know. And many people that are on those edge of society, they have no idea that they are those lotus flowers.
Okay, it's going again.
So those people that are at the edge, you know, they really don't know that they belong, that they are lotus flower. And so they reject that, they try to be anything else, they try to work, they join company, they join organization, and nothing really connects truly with them. And even when they try to change people, they realize there are some hard limits, and they are kind of stuck in this puzzle of blocks and people that have their limitation, and organization that have their own systemic dynamics, and they're like, how do I play with that? And they don't know that they belong to like a certain type or certain race, of people that have a certain role to play, and staying in the mud is part of that. You need the struggle a bit. You need to be a bit excluded out of society. You need that kind of sensibility.
And so you need to accept that that's the fertile ground, right? The mud. So for me, that image very much links to, like really understanding what are the places that we don't go to, what are the places that we avoid, what is the hidden shadow within our own culture. And I think it's very uncomfortable to stay there, because you become like, you might sink. I mean, there's a danger in that. But at some point, it can nurture you to grow that lotus flower that you talk about. Mm. And I like that picture a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so maybe the question for me now that I'm having is, like what's your experience? What's your takeaway from Emerge? I mean, for me, I feel there was a lot going on in the last 2 days. And yeah, I just would like to hear from you maybe a little bit more of a reflection, and how do you put that, what we talked about, into a context of Emerge?
There are multiple layers of extraction. If I really go all in, it starts with a bunch of synchronicity and things that happen before the event and after the event, and small things that happen in between. So Emergence, I could just rationally talk about the ideas, or I could talk about the people. But if we are really going in this phenomenological experience, it goes much larger than that, So it started with our meeting. I send you a message. I say, there is something in your project that I really find funny, And we started with that. And then it continued along the way, seeing all kind of people, the archetype. Of course, we have a bit of the purely intellectual on the side. Then we have the people about the integral movement, very much into spirituality, sometimes a bit cultish, or maybe a bit theosophical, So, but all of that is part of it's just part of the network, Heidegger, he had a book about all his written correspondence, like letters, to Jasper. And in one of them, he said that some of his brilliant students in philosophy, they have this tendency for theosophical impulse. So sometimes a lot of brilliant people have a certain taste, or they have this drive for mystery that could drive them into pitfall of occultism, or place where nothing really happened, or it's not really fruitful. And those pitfalls are many in the world, from people waste a lot of time, a lot of people with great talent, since there is no structure, since they are too much into the mud and not enough of the great lotus flower, they waste a lot of time. And I could feel through some people reading diagonally to the story, loss of time. There's a lot of people with talent, with ideas, and it's very poorly managed. There is nothing to stick it together, nothing to support it. So through people I hear that, this kind of suffering, and they want to get this time back. So beyond that, I got few good ideas, from this idea of building a parallel polis and a parallel network, a parallel system, So there is the talk about cryptocurrency. We still need to talk a bit about later, so that you can tell me more about that. The talk about education, and basically everything that can help us grow this alternative that reward new kind of behavior, new kind of way of being, new kind of way of articulating yourself, that incentivize much more fruitful emergence, rather than trying to add into the existing system a fancy little word, a fancy little practice, and things that it's gonna, solve the world. So there is a necessity to change systematically multiple systems at the same time. And it's good to have a parallel police, a parallel economy, a parallel escape route for people to have. Another thing, it's little metaphor, little ideas coming from there. There was this guy I saw during a sort of speed dating event, and he had this very soft face. And I say, how come you have such a soft face? And he told me that through sorrow and through grieving, his face became softer. And it's related to empathy, and it makes him more empathetic from his perspective. And I really like that, some of the emotion, part of the ecology of emotion, really brings all kind of fruits. And when people are oriented toward this development of the inner self, there may always have been this blind spot about what do you do with anger, with sorrow, with those kind of emotion. But they are still part of the ecosystem. And one of the girls I really connected with, she told me that sorrow is a form of highly beautiful aesthetic. It's a beautiful way of seeing the world. It's a magnifying of what's important. And so there is a lot of, little bits like that of people sharing a little stuff there, a little observation from the way people interact with each other, the sort of friction. I really like the imaginary exercise where we learned to really see ourselves, we were really connected to nature. I think it was really good. And particularly I liked the implementation of the right to be cynical, the right to be on the critical side, And usually in a lot of conference or events, there is this missing part where people are not allowed to play the devil's advocate 100%. It's just like slight critic, but it's kind of within the system, But there is no like radical criticism. And by radical criticism, I also mean sometimes there's a lot of assumption that we all agree upon. For example, people said spirituality is important for personal development. And for me, I have to untangle what this means, why do you link that? You have to disagree earlier in the proposition, in the axiomatic proposition. So for me, really bringing an idea is disagreeing earlier in the proposition you bring, because it's still on the pillar of the culture and a lot of ideas that are built upon. And again, it's related to imagination. If we have the same base image, the other possibility coming forward are slightly more limited. So if you really want to have a richness, you need a lot of image here and a lot of image here. So you have to disagree and untangle the sentence and just be a bit slower, when people are like, oh yeah, it's very good, if I'm my best self, I can be the best in the world. And like, is it true? Just going slower, analyzing the sentence, going back and forth. So this is what having a critical mind means. It's not just rational. It's a sort of sensibility. Sometimes you just know there is something off. There is a broader problem. And that's why a lot of people that think they have a critical mind, they're just highly systematic people, systemic. They're just rational. Oh, there is something wrong there, But they don't see the whole thing going on around. They don't listen. So there is a bit of that. And if there is maybe one last thing about Emerge, I think it just everyone play a different role even within those kind of environments. So we are talking about the lotus flower, but there are other kind of sub-ecosystem to that lotus flower, and there is different variety. So you could see people came with their own kind of seeds, and some seeds are compatible with each other, others are not really. So it's really interesting to observe that and not completely be hypnotized by the talk, about the we together. Look within the we, between the line.
And in a way, the picture that comes is like a biotope.
Mm.
With different flowers, and it still be probably maybe like a forest or like a jungle. And I like that very much, of course, coming from the Black Forest. And I guess for me that it's almost too early to say what what I will digest and take out of it. But there was one participant who mentioned, he said like, yeah, it's great, it's a lot of fun, it's bubbly, it's like different streams. But he said it's not fermenting. So like, if you have a really good wine, you need to have the right ingredients so it can ferment, and that the grapes really grow into what the wine is. Mm-hmm. And that made me really think. So like what, because I felt like, there is something where we need to take care of this fermentation process, that we really digest it maybe, or that we also take the right ingredients and the right cultures, so to speak, like the yeast, so that we have that alchemical process almost, where we turn just some grapes, like that we gather here, into like a good wine, and like we need to really let it ripe. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely something that came up for me. And I agree with the, what is it actually what I feel when I feel that somebody's off? So what is it that makes us, like experience a coherence of thought, of feeling, maybe even doing? And how can we unfold that and live into that together? So that's for me definitely a question that I'm taking with me, mm-hmm. and also something that I feel needs more space and more practice.
Yeah, to continue on that, on what I am taking with me, like one of the core thing for me would be, I have no choice but to build my environment. Meaning, this lotus flower have a specific ecology, and I know it's not out there exactly. It has to emerge from this more pure, radical, highly, connected, singular self. So it reminded me of this necessity of the personal walk, the personal initiative I need to take, the personal mark I need to add on. Because there are not too many flowers like that, and they have a certain job to do. So if you are this kind of flower, or the people that feel like, hey, I feel like in my life there's not too many people that really belong to my biome of environments, and I need to do something about it. I need to make sure that my predecessor, the people after me, they have a nice place to grow, they have a nice stream. And when I read great books, sometimes I have this feeling that culture, like the sense of the art and all of that, is this kind of baton pass that great people give to each other, or that they give to humanity, and they're like, hey, this is a screenshot, this is a snapshot of the time I'm living in, here is the greatness of what we are experiencing, take that with you. And as I talk about the frozen sea that you break, I have the impression that many people sometime in those spheres, the reason why they may be a little more rigid to really access all of that is because there is not many events in their life that break the sea within them. And
it's the frozenness.
Exactly.
And I think this is the frozenness is what we feel, but it's still there also as a culture.
Exactly. And to get back of this frozenness, you need to remind yourself that there is greatness before you, and there's been a lot of icebreaker throughout history. So you should check that out, because a lot of people that will present themselves nowadays on the screen as the new, eloquent, parasocial relationships that you have with the screens might not be that good. And you need a frame of comparison. You need to know what in history was really great. You need to know in every sort of field, have a sense of when you say I'm building upon something, you need to know what it is. You have to have an idea, you have to be a bit cultured in a way to make a real contribution. Otherwise, I have the feeling that even if a lot of things we say are impressive, it's a kind of middle age where it's gonna be forgotten by history as a sort of gimmick, because there was no really great people, but they thought they were great because they said nice thing and they sound intellectual and they're nice new words. But you have to know what structure you are building upon and what you are adding to the culture of mankind. So that's for me a big important step for people to realize. Don't be too impressed with the screen, the black screen, the impression, the words, the eloquence. That's a big facade, and you need to realize that the way to cut down this hypnoticism is to break the seal, so you can hear better, you can see better, you can act better, to have a bit of culture, so within your sea there are better nutriments, you have the best sea possible for yourself, and you become like, we had in this meditation, they talk about the bacteria, like our body is very few, like the DNA, there is a lot of parasites and all of that are mostly doing the work. And it's kind of like, let's have the best parasite possible, the best bacteria, so that when we hear, they can sense and be like, there is something off, or I can do something else, and get back this agency, because you have this full vivid imagination. You can see, you can hear, you can taste, you can imagine. So there is a lot of hypnoticism going on with all of that. And when people have no culture, no history, when they don't remember their feeling, they are full beings, they will get fooled, and they will enter like the machine. They will become like machine, basically, and automata, that just follow, repeat. And you see that in community, the memes, the ideas, the same thing over and over again, that just repeat itself. And people have become so disengaged with their own language that they don't realize that. And words just come out like that.
And I think here, that's also like what I realized is, for a lot of people, it's still maybe an unconscious decision, or it's a sensibility, it's like an intuition, it's a feeling that there is something in metamodern gatherings like Emerge. And I think that's very true. So there's this longing for more depth than what we experience in this fragmentation and frozenness that we have experienced and that we know so well outside. And I think, working in art, like letting an art piece emerge, or like writing a book, it's maybe not changing the world, but it's really contributing in a certain way to deepening that fertile ground, and to unfreeze it, so that some of lotus flowers might bloom.
Yes, I think that's a good wrap up for the conversation. This really encapsulates a bit of the feeling we got from this event. If there is maybe one last thing or one last idea that may be in your mind, or one last thing you're feeling.
I think it's quite quite glad actually to have met you,
Yeah.
and I'm very, very much looking forward, to discover that cultural underneath, and to be on that journey with you, and see how, metamodernism will land and unfold in Paris and in France.
Yeah. Yeah, so this conversation was sort of like, let's talk about metamodernism, but make it less Nordic, and slightly land into a more, spread out.
Yeah.
So that was a nice conversation for that, I think. So that's gonna be it for today. That was a great conversation with you. I really want to follow, your project and see how it unfolds. If I can, do something in Paris for that.
Would love to. Would love to connect and be in Paris and continue the conversation and see what, grows out of that connection we have.
Yeah.